Early on the evening of June 12, 2012, a 25-year-old woman named Noemi Belanger opened up the door to her hotel room on Phi Phi Island, which is a major tourist destination in Thailand. Once the door was unlocked, Noemi pushed it open and she held it for her little sister, 20-year-old Audrey, who came in wheeling all their suitcases. Noemi and Audrey were both from Quebec, Canada, and they were also both college students, and they were on this big month-long vacation to celebrate the end of the school year. They had been in Vietnam for the past 3 weeks, and today they had arrived in Thailand, and their plan was to stay here for a bit before finally heading back to Quebec. But for right now, Noemi in particular was feeling really exhausted. I mean, there was a lot of travel getting here today, and the past 3 weeks had been loads of travel, and Noemi was kind of hitting a wall. And so as soon as she got into the room, all she really wanted to do was just flop down on the bed and just lay there for a little while. But she had also become a fairly experienced traveler by this point, and she knew before she did that, she just wanted to make sure that, the bed was cleanly, make sure there were no bed bugs or, unclean sheets or something. And so she went over and pulled the sheets back and checked, and the sheets were pristine. It was beautiful. The room felt super nice. And so she just flopped down on the bed and just enjoyed the air conditioning. And at the same time that she was doing this, Audrey, who very likely was also feeling all the, the symptoms of travel over so many weeks. I mean, she likely was very, very tired. But she, instead of laying down, went right into the bathroom and started getting ready for the night. And Noemi sort of understood why. So while the girls were in Vietnam, they had met these two really nice guys who were from Brazil, and they had kind of hit it off, and they had left today to go to Thailand, and wouldn't you know it, it turned out those guys, their itinerary included them coming to Thailand today. And so it was kind of like this revelation at the end of their time in Vietnam that they would not have to say goodbye basically forever, but instead, the good times could keep on rolling in Thailand. And so the plan was that night they would meet up with these two guys, these Brazilian guys, out on the beach and basically party with them and just have a fun night. Now, Noemi was looking forward to this night out with these two guys, but she also had a little bit of apprehension about it. I mean, these guys were perfectly nice, and she and her sister had spent time with them in Vietnam, and really things had been fine. But, Noemi felt like Audrey was a little bit more naive and sort of like easier to be taken advantage of than she was. I mean, she was younger than her by 5 years, and also when the sisters had gone on this trip, their parents had been really apprehensive about, two young women traveling alone together all over the world. I mean, they were sort of vulnerable. And so the way Noemi had sort of played it to her parents is, don't worry, I'm the big sister. I'll keep my eye on Audrey. She'll be fine. And Audrey kind of played the role of younger sister and was like, yep, I'll do what my big sister says. And so Noemi sort of felt like she had a responsibility to keep Audrey safe. And so she was feeling a bit apprehensive about whatever they were going to do that night with these guys. It just sort of seemed like things were sort of moving quickly with these two guys. They should have maybe just stopped in Vietnam, but they're here. And so who knows what was going to happen. And so Noemi, as she's laying there and Audrey's getting ready, Noemi decides to just give her parents a call. Because one of the things Noemi had been doing over the past several weeks they'd been on this big vacation is sort of constantly updating her parents to assuage their concerns that anything was wrong, with their two kids. Noemi wanted her parents to see that she was doing everything she could, to keep her and her sister safe. And so she pulled out her phone and she was about to call her parents when suddenly Audrey appeared from the bathroom and said, stop. And she told her like, hey, remember, it's evening for us, but back home in Canada, it's the middle of the night. So you're gonna be waking them up and they're gonna have loads of questions like, why are you calling in the middle of the night? And probably you're gonna have to tell them about, how we're going out tonight with these two guys and they're gonna worry. Like, don't do that. Spare them. We will talk to them tomorrow. They don't need to know what we're doing tonight. Everything is fine. And Noemi was thinking, you know what? She's right. This is a bad time to call. Noemi actually forgot, the time change was so significant. And she also, wasn't sure what she would say to her parents about, going out with these two guys because it would raise some red flags. And so Noemi put her phone down and decided, you know what? Tonight's gonna be just fine. I just gotta let things go. And so she actually climbed off the bed and she joined her sister in the bathroom and began also getting ready for their big night out. A little bit later, Noemi and Audrey left their hotel room and they headed out to the beach. And sure enough, there, right outside of a beachfront bar, were the two Brazilian guys they were meeting up with that night. And as the two girls approached, they saw that each of these guys were holding these big buckets. They almost looked like, a toy that a child would use on the sand, to fill it up and make a sandcastle with, like a big, beach bucket. And, the girls, as they're walking over, they're wondering what these buckets were for, and they thought it was maybe like some joke these guys were gonna play, or they didn't know what. But as they got closer, they realized that these buckets these guys were holding were filled to the brim with ice and liquid. There was some sort of drink in these buckets. And so the girls walked up to them and they said hello, and very quickly the conversation turned to these big drinks they were holding. And Noemi and Audrey were like, what are those? And the guys told them, these are like these amazing cocktails that you can only get in this part of the world. The girls asked, well, what is it? What's inside of the drink? What makes it so special? And the guys kind of looked at each other and laughed, and they're like, I don't know, just try it. It's really good. It'll make you feel great. Now, Noemi, being the sort of more responsible one, did not immediately begin drinking either of these drinks. Instead, she sort of paused and thought about it, but Audrey, on the other hand, was totally sold. She reached forward, grabbed one of the buckets, and just began chugging this drink. And so Noemi's looking at her like, come on, like, you can't just jump into this. We don't know what this stuff is. But, after a couple of chugs, Audrey lowered the bucket and looked at her sister, and she just grinned, and she handed it back to her guy, and then she told Noemi, like, these taste great. This is awesome. Like, you gotta try it. Loosen up. And so at this point, Noemi, she's considering the situation. They were in Vietnam with these guys, and these guys were out partying with them. They were drinking with them, and, they seemed perfectly trustworthy, and they were clearly drinking from these buckets, and it didn't seem nefarious. And also, Noemi looked around the beach and suddenly realized that basically everybody had these big buckets. This was not just these two guys. Everybody's drinking this thing. And so Noemi's thinking, okay, well, if they think it's okay and it's sort of normal, in this part of the world, then it's gotta be okay. And so she reached forward, grabbed the other bucket from the other guy, and took a big sip. Several hours later, well after the sun had gone down, Audrey and Noemi were having a great time with their Brazilian friends. They were still near this beachfront bar. They were actually dancing right outside of it because now there was a DJ blaring some music and there were all these people. And actually the sisters had sort of broken up and were sort of doing their own thing with their respective guy, but they were sort of near enough each other that they could kind of keep tabs on each other. And they were just having a great time. By this point, they had jumped in the ocean and gone swimming. They had eaten a ton of local food. And Noemi had lost count of how many of these big bucket drinks they had all consumed together. But they were really just having a blast. Noemi's vision was a bit blurry and she was kind of stumbling, and she'd look over at Audrey and she was kind of in the same state, as were the two guys they were with. They're buzzed. They're having a great time. And so the two girls and their guys are just out there dancing, doing their thing. It's about 1 a.m. at this point, and Noemi's guy says to her, hey, do you want to head back to the hotel room together? And Noemi's like, yeah, let's go back. But hold on, I want to talk to my sister first. And so Noemi kind of stumbles her way over to Audrey, who's in the middle of this big dance routine with her guy, and she stops Audrey and she whips around, and Audrey's all smiles too. And Noemi's like, hey, do you want to go back to the hotel room? We're going back now. Do you want to come? And Audrey's like, no, I want to stay here. I'm having too much fun. This is awesome. We're just going to keep on dancing. You guys should stay too. But Noemi was like, no, I got to go. We're going to go back. So you sure you want to stay? And Audrey was like, yeah, we'll stay. We'll see you at the hotel soon. Now, typically, Noemi and her sister really rarely separated, especially when they were out drinking and partying, because of all the inherent risks of being alone at night, potentially intoxicated. And so, this was kind of a rare thing for her to break away from her sister and separate. But it just seemed like this was okay. It was safe. And, these guys they were with, they really seemed like stand-up guys. And again, they were just having a blast here, and Noemi didn't really want to stop her from having a good time. And so ultimately, she did say bye to her sister and said she'd see her soon. Noemi turned, and with her guy, she headed back to the hotel, and Audrey kept on dancing with her guy in front of the beach bar. Later, on the evening of June 15th, a member of the housekeeping staff at the hotel where Noemi and Audrey were staying walked up to the girls' room, and they knocked. And like it had been the past 2 days, they didn't get a response because over the past couple of days, the housekeeping staff had not seen anybody come in or out of this room. And now it had gotten to the point where they really had to get in there to clean the room. And basically, if they didn't get a response, this staff member was going to have to unlock the door and just go in there. And so one more time, they knocked on the door and called out, housekeeping, just in case somebody was in there. But again, there was silence. So the staff member put their card into the door, they unlocked it, they opened it up, and stepped inside. And seconds later, that staff member was literally running out of the hotel room, screaming for help. At 9 p.m. that night, a team of police officers, led by Lieutenant Colonel Rat Somboon, arrived at the hotel room. Somboon was an experienced police officer, and he'd already been briefed on what was found inside the hotel room. So when he and his team walked inside and saw it for themselves, he wasn't shocked. When they got in there, they found two women inside. It was Noemi and Audrey Belanger. And both of them were lying in their respective beds, tucked up in their sheets, lying perfectly still, and each of them was completely surrounded by vomit. Somboon estimated that these two women had been dead for between 12 and 20 hours, and his first theory as to what might have killed them was alcohol poisoning. I mean, that would explain the vomit. This was also a big tourist destination, and clearly these people were tourists, and so maybe they were out partying and they died from alcohol poisoning. However, when Somboon looked more closely at the bodies, he noticed a confounding detail. There was all this dried blood on the girls' gums and also under their fingernails. And so that was not consistent with alcohol poisoning. And so Somboon thought, okay, well, maybe the reason they have blood in these parts of their body is because those are defensive injuries. Maybe somebody attacked these girls and that's how they've been killed. But after doing a cursory check around the hotel room, there was no sign of a struggle or any sort of break-in or anything like that. And so, if there had been some sort of lethal struggle in here, it certainly didn't show. And so Somboon and his team really didn't have any idea what had happened here. I mean, they had some ideas, but clearly they needed more information. Specifically, they needed to do an autopsy and a full toxicology report on both women. That would be the only way to really see what happened here. But that would take time. And so while they waited for those results to come in, Somboon decided that what he would focus on instead is trying to figure out what these girls were doing in the hours before they died. Where were they? What did they eat? What did they drink? And who were they with? Over the next couple of days, Somboon and his team interviewed several of the hotel staff. And from those interviews, they learned that Audrey and Noemi were visiting Thailand from Canada. And on the first night they were here, the two women went out early in the evening, and then one of them came back with some guy, some unidentified man, at 1 a.m. They came back to the hotel. And then at 4 a.m., the other girl came back to the hotel, also with an unidentified man. And so there are Noemi and Audrey and these two unidentified men that are in the hotel room, presumably, from 4 a.m. until 6 a.m., when both of these unidentified men left the hotel room together, and the two girls were presumably left inside the hotel room. Lieutenant Somboon reviewed some security footage from the hotel, which confirmed this entire timeline was correct, which meant Somboon really needed to speak to these two unidentified men because they clearly were the last ones to see these girls alive. And so the police department put out an announcement about Noemi and Audrey's deaths, as well as a public call for help in identifying these two unidentified men. And shortly after making this announcement, the police learned that these two men were Brazilian, and unfortunately, they had already left Thailand on their way back to Brazil. And so obviously Brazil is outside of his jurisdiction, and so he had to appeal to Interpol, which is an international police organization, and appeal to them to find these two Brazilian men and interview them. About a week later, Somboon finally got a call from Interpol. They had found these two men and they had interviewed them. And they told Somboon that when they informed these two guys that Noemi and Audrey had died, the two men seemed genuinely shocked. And then when they were asked, why were you so quickly on a flight out of Thailand back to Brazil? They said, no, there's nothing suspicious about it. We already had booked those tickets way in advance. We just got on the flight and left. There's nothing more to it. And so Interpol said they continued to press these guys and asked them, hey, you were the last ones who were with these girls before they died. Tell us about their condition. Tell us how you left them when you left the hotel at 6 a.m. And the two guys, they said, look, they did seem like maybe they were already hungover or sort of sick from, partying the night before. They definitely did seem a little bit down, but they were basically fine. However, Interpol said it was fairly interesting that the two men did admit that following, their night out with Noemi and Audrey, that the next 2 days, they were stuck in bed themselves, totally sick, vomiting, ill. They didn't know what from, but they said they were very, very sick following their encounter with these two girls. Somboon thanked the Interpol officer and then hung up. And even though Somboon couldn't help but feel still pretty suspicious of these two Brazilian guys, he now was thinking, okay, well, if they said they got really sick after, spending time with Noemi and Audrey, maybe what happened here is, all 4 of them got sick with something, some illness, and the guys survived it and the girls didn't. And so Songbun began to think of, what type of illnesses could they have contracted? And the first thing that Songbun began to think about that could have been an illness that all 4 of these tourists could have contracted was food poisoning. Tourists come to Thailand and try the local food, and sometimes it makes them really, really sick. In particular, there were 2 types of food in Thailand that were sort of notorious for giving tourists just the worst food poisoning. One of them was a particular type of mushroom, and another was blowfish. And these 2 items, if your body reacted badly enough to them, it could be lethal. However, when Songbun got back the autopsy reports and the toxicology reports, he realized his theory about food poisoning was definitely wrong. So it would turn out those drinks that the girls had with the guys in those big buckets, they were unique to Thailand. Those are not drinks that are served really anywhere else in the world. And that's because those drinks are just not safe. And for whatever reason, it sort of blossomed in Thailand and it's sort of an accepted thing, but when you hear the ingredients of what's in this drink, you'll understand why it's not like a sanctioned or more popular thing outside of this small part of the world. So there is no alcohol in these big buckets of liquid. Instead, it includes crushed up narcotics, it includes cough syrup and Coca-Cola, and in some cases, pesticide. In fact, specifically DEET, which is the main ingredient in mosquito repellent. And wouldn't you know it, in the reports that Songbun got back, he saw both of these girls clearly had ingested DEET, which again is a highly toxic chemical. However, despite learning this, even though this seemed to be clearly what happened here, this is a DEET poisoning case, Songbun's thinking to himself, how could this have happened? I mean, these drinks, which are called 4x100s, are pretty popular in Thailand, and people are not just turning up dead left and right. It's a dangerous drink, no doubt, but people do not die with any regularity from drinking it. And so Songbun thought, what must have happened here is whoever mixed this particular batch of 4x100s must have accidentally included too much DEET. And so that would explain how, the 2 girls died from DEET poisoning, too much DEET in their drinks, and that very likely the guys as well consumed the same batch, which had tons of DEET in it, but their bodies were able to withstand it and they survived it despite getting very, very sick. And so 9 days after the 2 girls had died, their bodies were sent from Thailand back to Canada, along with the Thai police's official findings that this was an accidental DEET poisoning. However, when Noemi and Audrey's remains arrived in Canada, they did not go straight to their family. Instead, they went to a leading coroner in Quebec whose name was René Roussel. So by this point, the girls' parents were obviously heartbroken, but more than that, they were furious. The way they found out about the deaths of their daughters was on the media. I mean, despite the fact that the police were immediately called when the girls were found dead, the Thai police did not get in touch with the family. They only got in touch after their investigation was done, and they're like, hey, by the way, your daughters are dead, and it was a DEET poisoning. It is what it is. Good luck. And so the parents felt like, are you kidding me? Like, you didn't loop us in at all? We're spending days trying to get in touch with our daughters, and you knew all along they were already dead? So the parents have no faith, no trust in the Thai police, and then to find out, wait a minute, so they drank this drink that apparently is sold at this beach bar all the time, and oh yeah, it killed them, no big deal. What, there's no warnings at this beach bar about how dangerous this drink is? Shouldn't there be like a tourist warning or something? And also, it's kind of a lazy explanation that, well, the 2 guys they were with drank the same poison, but they didn't die just 'cause, and our daughters did. That doesn't add up either. This whole thing feels like laziness, at best, or at worst, a cover-up. Maybe this looks really bad for Thailand that these tourists have died and it could have been prevented. And so the parents felt like, we can't just take their explanation at face value. Clearly, something is going on here. Something's wrong. And apparently, the Canadian government felt the same way as the parents. This case was all over the news, and they also felt like, wait a minute, guys, we haven't looked closely enough at this. What's really going on here? And so it was actually the Canadian government who told René Roussel to go ahead and do another autopsy on these girls' remains. Let's really see if it was DEET that killed them, or maybe if it was something else. And when René checked Noemi and Audrey's bodies, she did discover there was DEET in their system. However, not nearly enough to kill them. So while it seemed plainly obvious that yes, they must have consumed those 4x100 drinks, that couldn't have been the thing that actually killed them. However, Renee didn't find any other poisonous substances in these girls' bodies. Like, there wasn't another explanation. It just showed there was DEET, but that was basically it. And so Renee, she's thinking like there's gotta be some explanation here. And so Renee really began to do some serious research into this whole case, and eventually she found something. And it horrified her, it horrified the family, it horrified the world. It would turn out, from Renee Roussel's additional research, Noemi and Audrey were far from the first tourists to die this way in Thailand. Between 2009 and 2015, at least 20 tourists have been found dead under very similar circumstances. Now, Renee believed that what must have happened here is all these people, including Noemi and Audrey, must have been poisoned, but the common denominator did not appear to be food or drink. It had to be something else that was poisoning them. Something that was damaging blood vessels that would account for the blood under the fingernails and the gums, but also metabolized so quickly that after death, this particular poison could not be detected. And Renee figured out she was correct. So when Noemi and Audrey first arrived in Thailand, they went to their hotel room, and one of the first things that Noemi did is she pulled back her sheets to check for bed bugs. She wanted to make sure her bed was clean before she laid down and relaxed. And when she looked, it appeared clean. And it was because the sheets were clean. They had actually just been treated for bed bugs, so there were no bed bugs. However, the way this hotel and other hotels, not just in Thailand, but in other parts of the world, the way they were treating for bed bugs was by spraying the sheets with pesticide, specifically phosphine gas, which is highly toxic to bed bugs, so it gets rid of the bed bugs, but it's also highly toxic to people. For reference, it is illegal to do this. You're not allowed to spray sheets with pesticide. And so based on all the evidence, it's believed that what actually happened to Noemi, Audrey, and the two Brazilian men they were with is that they climbed into those beds on the night they came back, and the men were in there with them for some time, and all four of them were being exposed to this phosphine gas. It was going in through their skin, they were breathing it in, and they likely had no idea. And so they're getting sicker and sicker. And then finally, the two men, they get up out of the beds and they leave at 6 a.m. They've now been, totally contaminated by this poison, but not enough to kill them. So they go home, and over the next couple of days, they get really sick from their exposure to this gas. But Audrey and Noemi, they didn't leave their bed. They stayed in those beds all night. And unfortunately, as they laid there, their bodies continued soaking in all of this poison, and their bodies just could not handle it. And so it eventually killed them. But despite learning this, and despite the fact that clearly something illegal was done here, you cannot spray your bed sheets in a hotel with pesticide to get rid of the bed bugs. It's incredibly hazardous. You can't do it. Despite that, to this day, no one has been held accountable for these girls' deaths. Middle of the night on March 7th, 2005, a 64-year-old man named John Mangine crouched in the bushes in his little village in Uganda. Several of John's friends and neighbors were also crouching in bushes nearby, and everyone was being totally silent, constantly scanning the area, looking for movement. But so far, nothing had happened, and everyone was totally exhausted and terrified. So John had been around for a long time. He had 9 kids, 31 grandkids, and he remembered a time that was not even that long ago when this village was a happy, bustling place where, families and kids could play in harmony and everyone felt safe. But that all changed 14 years earlier in 1991. Because starting in that year, people in this village started dying. Or more specifically, people in this village started getting killed by someone they didn't know. It was like randomly people would just go missing and then turn up horribly mutilated and deceased, or people just vanished and were never seen again. Over the course of these 14 years, 83 people from this village had been killed and nobody knew why. And 83 people, to put this in perspective, represented 10% of this entire village's population. This was so widespread that everybody in John's village personally knew someone who had been killed by whatever was plaguing this village. And at some point, the people in this village began to think that Clearly, a demon is responsible for this. I mean, this is so pervasive that this can't be an animal or a person. This is like, God's will or something, or this is, the devil's will. We don't know, but it's supernatural. Like, we can't control this. It just is a part of living here. And so literally this village, the people here, had just grown to accept that, yep, sometimes people just turn up mutilated and dead. There's nothing we can do about it. We just got to live with it. But John, he personally knew several people who had been killed, and he never took the stance of, well, it's supernatural and we can't do anything about it. John's like, no, we need to look into this. There's gotta be an actual explanation for what's happening here. And so finally, in 2005, the tipping point was a little boy went missing in the village one morning. And for John, he has all these grandkids, including a bunch of little boys, and he saw this little boy go missing and, he was never found again. And John's thinking, that's just like one of my grandkids. This has to stop. We gotta look now. We have to look into this now. And so John very forcefully rounded up some people in the village, his friends and neighbors and others, and he told them, tonight we are going to set up a stakeout and stay out all night if we have to, and wait for this demon, this creature, this person, whoever it is. We are gonna catch them in the act and put an end to this thing. And because John was so motivated, so enthusiastic, and so ready to sort of lead this thing, he really quickly turned the tide of people's opinions in this village. It's like they went from being, oh, we can't do anything about it, to, you know what, yeah, let's put an end to this thing. And so sure enough, that night, John and all these people he had got together for this stakeout, they headed to this area in their village called the Butchery. They had named it that because the majority of the 83 people who had been killed and mutilated and, turned up dead, they were either found roughly in that area, or that's where they were last seen before they vanished. And the butchery was actually basically right next to this lake, this placid lake that sort of sat right next to the village. So everybody's scared of this lake and this area, but tonight's the night. They're gonna figure out what's happening in this village. And so John and the other volunteers, they make their way over to the butchery, and they each climb into these tall bushes, these reeds that are right next to the lake, and they all crouch down, kind of keeping their eyes on the land, the butchery, and also the lake. And there they sat. All of them constantly looking at each other, maintaining eye contact, to stay safe. And they're looking at each other, they're looking at the water, the black water that's totally still, and there's nothing on land, it's still, it's silent. And for hours, they just sat there nervously watching, waiting for something to happen. They didn't know what it was gonna be. They didn't know if, one of the volunteers in the stakeout was suddenly gonna be ripped away by this demon or whatever it was. But all night, on this first night of the stakeout, they're waiting and watching on edge, and nothing happens. And so John the next morning says, we gotta do it again. We gotta go back out there and do another stakeout because we know there's something out there. And so sure enough, night 2 rolls around, and now they have even more volunteers. They're motivated, they're out there in the bushes, waiting, watching the lake, watching the land, but nothing happens again. And this cycle continues for 4 more days where nothing happens. John is rallying people every night to keep going back out there, but the group is getting more and more tired. They're staying out all night. It's also sort of deflating to realize that, it looks like we don't have control over whatever's happening here. Like, we can't catch this thing. We don't even know what it is. And so after 6 days of this, where they have seen nothing, no one's been taken, no one's been killed, it's been totally quiet in the village, John rallies the people one more time. He goes, one more night, give me one more, I know we're gonna catch something. And so he got the village to kind of agree to go out for one more night. And this night, unlike the others, John decided to do something different to try to sort of entice, whatever this creature or person or whoever it was, whatever it was, to entice them out of hiding. He and the villagers strung up all this organ meat in the trees right near the butchery, believing that, whoever was killing these people was seeking their meat. And so they put the meat up on the trees. And so that night, the 7th night, John and the others, after putting their organ meat in the trees, crouched down in the bushes, waiting and watching. It's silent, it's dark. At first, nothing happens. And as the night goes on and on, people are starting to think, it's just another night where nothing's gonna happen. And people are starting to get restless. And John's telling them, be quiet, stay still. We gotta wait, we gotta watch, see what happens. Hours and hours go by, nothing. But then, between 4 or 5 in the morning, it's still dark out, the water's black, it's still and silent, and people are really starting to get restless at this point. They begin to hear something.
It's like this low grumbling sound that appears to be coming from the lake, but it's hard to tell. The lake was pretty big and it was still dark out. They're looking out at the water and it's just dark. And they're right near the water. And so they're hearing this rumbling sound and everyone's kind of looking out like this is the first time anything has happened during one of these stakeouts. And John, he's telling them, stay down, stay quiet. And they're looking out at the water and it's still. But this rumbling, growling sound, it starts getting louder and louder and louder. It's so loud at a certain point that John, he can feel his body literally trembling from the sound. And as that begins to happen, even with the minimal light, they're looking out at the black water and they notice ripples on the surface of the water. Something's moving in the lake. And so everybody's looking and waiting, everyone's scared. John looks over at the other people who are in the other set of bushes right near him, and he can see their eyes are wide, they're terrified, but everyone's looking out at the water. And then eventually this massive, dark silhouette emerges from the lake, and this loud growl fills the air and everyone's frozen, and then whatever it is charges towards John. But it doesn't go after John. This huge creature runs past John and bites down on the meat dangling from the trees. But the meat, they had placed hooks in the meat like a trap. And as soon as this thing bit onto the meat, it got snared in one of the traps and it couldn't move. And John, who had been waiting for this moment, even though he has no idea what's happened here, he knew he needed backup. And so he got up and sprinted into the village and began screaming for everyone to come out here and help us. And so 50 villagers came pouring out of their homes and they all descended on the tree with all the organ meat and this huge creature dangling and thrashing from the trap. And they suddenly realized that what had been plaguing their village was not a demon. It was instead the largest saltwater crocodile ever found in Uganda. This crocodile was 16 feet long, over 2,000 pounds. I mean, this thing is massive. And for 14 years, this crocodile had been sneaking into the village, grabbing people and dragging them back to the lake. And nobody had seen it. Or more specifically, anyone who had seen this crocodile, this beast, did not live to tell the tale. Authorities were quickly called to the village, and they wouldn't allow the villagers to kill this crocodile as much as they wanted to. Instead, the crocodile was relocated. One morning in April of 1848, a group of men were walking towards the coast of King William Island, which is an island located in the freezing Arctic region of northern Canada. These men were members of the Inuit people, who are indigenous to King William Island. And today, they were going hunting. Specifically, they were making their way towards the coastline to see if they could find any seals that they could hunt and kill for food and for clothing. However, even though technically the coastline was right in front of them, they couldn't actually see the water because there was this huge icy hill that obstructed their view. So in order to look down to the water, they would have to crest that hill and then look down. As these hunters got closer to the hill, the youngest of the hunters broke from the group and ran up the hill to basically get an early look over and see if he could spot any animals down below. However, as soon as he crested the hill and scanned the coastline, again, you got a picture, it's snowy, icy outside, it's below 0 degrees. I mean, you're in the Arctic wild here. He's looking down and at first, all he sees is just white, just snow, ice, but he sees something else. And as he's looking at it, he can't even understand what he's seeing. Like, it doesn't make sense. It's not computing. And so at this point, the young hunter kind of ducked down on this side of the hill, kind of away and out of view of the ocean, and he turned and signaled to the other hunters to get up here and take a look. And so the other hunters, they don't really understand what's happening here, but they can see, there's some urgency coming from this young hunter. And so they run up the hill as well, and all together, all at once, they kind of peer up and over the hill again, and they look down, and for a second, they all just stared in horrified silence. Down below, wandering along the coastline, were not seals or walruses or any other animals that these hunters might have expected to see out here. Instead, they saw people. Specifically, they saw Kalunat, which is their word for white men. But these men were not acting like people. They were lumbering, almost like they weren't in control of their bodies. They had these strange, jerky movements, and they were all just kind of staring straight ahead with these vacant expressions, and their skin, it was like black and blue, and their clothes were tattered, and they were just kind of lumbering along, about 40 of these Kalunat, these white men. Now, for these hunters, they really didn't have much exposure or experience around Kalunat, around white men. All they really knew at the time and in this part of the world is that white men were pretty dangerous to the indigenous people. But they did know there was a group of Kalunat who were staying on a ship that was off the coast of King William Island, and they had been living there for the better part of a year, and it seemed like their ship might have frozen off the coast, and they were just kind of trapped until the warmer months came around and they could sail away. But to this point, the Inuit people really had not seen or interacted with any of those white people. They had just kind of kept to themselves, and that was it. So just to see the Kalunat, the white people, on land, that alone was really shocking. Like, what happened? Why did they leave their ship? Why are they here? But again, the way they were moving and how they looked, it seemed wrong. Like there was something wrong with these people. Like there's more to this story than the Inuit people understand. And it was sort of terrifying. And on top of just the way they were moving, there was something else these Kalunat were doing. In addition to these men just kind of lumbering along the coastline, a few of them were dragging this big sled. And there was a tarp over the sled. Clearly something big or several things were under this tarp. But the Inuit hunters, they couldn't quite tell what it was covered up. And so they're just watching these men in this weird parade along the coastline with the sled, and they really were like, we have to get out of here. And so they ducked their heads below the icy hill to kind of stay out of view of the Kalunat, who to this point it did not seem like they had spotted the hunters. And as the hunters are sort of trying to figure out what they should even do, they hear this awful guttural scream coming from down below where these men are, where these white men are. And instinctively, the hunters, they grab their spears and they poke their head up over the hill, almost thinking maybe they've spotted us, maybe they're gonna attack us. But no, when they look down below, many of the Kalunat were still just kind of lumbering along, but one of them had stopped, and he was kind of retching around like there was something wrong with him, and he continued to scream out, and then he just crumpled to the ground. But the other white men, it was like they didn't even react to it, except for the men pulling the sled. They pulled the sled right up alongside this man who had just fallen to the ground after screaming, and they just sort of nonchalantly pulled back the tarp, revealing all sorts of bodies on the sled. They picked the guy who had just fallen, and they threw him onto the pile, they covered him back up with the tarp, and then, like nothing had happened, the men kept on pulling the sled, and this totally creepy procession continued down the coast. At this point, the Inuit hunters were genuinely terrified, and without saying anything, they just scrambled back down the hill and ran back to their village. The following day, the Inuit hunters came back to that exact spot, that icy hill that looked down to the ocean below. Except this time, they had brought along several pounds of seal meat. So the previous day, when these hunters had gone back to their village to tell the others about what they had just seen, oddly enough, the consensus became that, of course the Kalunat are sort of dangerous to us and we should keep our distance. But from what you're describing, it sounds an awful lot like these men, these white men, must just be starving. Like the way they're moving, the fact that men are falling down and dying, and they have this, sled full of dead bodies. They're out here in the Arctic wild. I mean, this is a very unforgiving place. And so the consensus was, they're starving to death. That's what you're seeing. That's why they're acting the way they are. And so maybe the move here is you hunters go back to that same spot, try to find these Kalunat, and give them some food, not only to help them, to be good people, good stewards of humanity, but also as sort of like a peace offering, because there was tension between the Inuit people and the Kalunat. And so these hunters had agreed. They had showed up with the intention of, finding these 40 some odd white men, giving them some food, and maybe even offering some help, if they needed it. And so that day, the Inuit hunters, they make it back to their spot, they climb up that icy hill, and they look down towards the ocean below, and there's nobody there. It's just complete isolation. And so the hunters, they go down to the coastline and they see footprints from the day before. They find, the tracks from the sled that had been being dragged, and they just start tracking the footprints of these white men. And for hours, these hunters are just following the footprints along this coastline, in the snow and the ice, and they're looking up ahead. They don't see anybody, and it's like, wow, like these guys, they covered a huge amount of ground. Like, where did they go? And eventually, after hours of this, the hunters come upon this campsite, but it's totally abandoned. It's right on the edge of the water, and based on where the campsite was and sort of how fresh it looked, it seemed pretty obvious that at some point, clearly the Kalunat had been camped out here, but they clearly are not here now. But interestingly, The people that had been here, presumably the white men, they had left behind quite a few of their supplies. Like there was the remains of a fire, and sitting over the fire was this big pot, like a metal pot. And you would think if you're struggling to survive out here that you would definitely want to keep some of your cooking supplies. But no, that was left behind, along with several other tools. And so the Inuit hunters, they're looking around thinking, okay, well, maybe they just stepped away and they're gonna come back. But they searched the vicinity of the campsite, but nobody was there. The footprints just kind of picked up and continued off into the distance. And so feeling pretty puzzled by this, the Inuit hunters decided to just search the campsite and try to get some clue as to what's going on with these white men. And eventually, after searching through all the different things that had been left behind, they came back to that fire and that pot that had a lid over it that was sitting right there. And one of the hunters walks up to the pot, he grabs the lid, he lifts it off, and when he saw what was inside, he reeled back in horror. Several months later, that same group of Inuit hunters had hiked miles and miles down that same coastline of King William Island until they saw off in the distance, right off the coast, this big wooden ship. And these hunters knew this ship belonged to the Colonat. Today, their plan was to break into the ship and raid it, because just recently, these hunters had finally kind of solved the mystery of what happened to those, 40 some odd white men they had seen. Because they came across this mass gravesite, of like 30 plus white men all dead in the snow. And clearly they had starved to death and died from exposure. And so it just sort of seemed like this unfortunate thing that these guys had hiked and hiked and hiked and just kind of fell down and died. But now that the Inuit hunters knew that all these white men were dead, they're like, well, there's a ship sitting right out there that, no one's gonna claim, so why don't we take whatever's inside of it? And so the Inuit hunters walked out onto the ocean, which was completely frozen. So the ship, it's off the coast, but it's basically a pathway of ice right up to the ship. And so the hunters, they walked on this ice all the way out to the ship. And when they got there, unsurprisingly, it was totally vacant. It's silent, it's still, clearly there's nobody in this ship. Now, as the Inuit hunters climbed the side of the ship and got ready to go inside, they all had set their expectations to be like, okay, clearly the men who had inhabited this ship at one point, the white men, the Colonat, they obviously abandoned the ship and, tried their luck on land unsuccessfully. So clearly something must have happened out here. Like they ran out of food, or there was a leak in the ship, or some sort of chaos ensued here that caused them to abandon their shelter and, head towards the Arctic wilds, right? But once they got on board the ship and looked around, they quickly realized the ship was in pristine condition. I mean, there was no damage to the ship. It was practically brand new, preserved out in the ice here. When they went down below, they discovered there were all these bedrooms with these incredibly comfortable looking beds, and there was bunk beds and hammocks with linens and pillows. There was a library with hundreds of books. There were games. There was all this cutlery and fine china. And just off the kitchen, in their pantry, was this massive food storage room full of food, canned goods, all still good, that apparently had just been left behind. And so the Inuit hunters, they're thinking like, how is this possible? What caused these white men to abandon their ship, which presumably was perfect, pristine, provided much better shelter, and also they abandoned all their food, like they clearly weren't starving. So what happened? What caused them to go on land and die horrible deaths? Well, the reason for this would not fully make sense for another 130 years, because it was in the 1980s when researchers actually began to analyze the remains of these white men, those 30, 40 white men who were found dead on King William Island. It would turn out those men were explorers who had been sent out to the Arctic by the British government. And they had been well outfitted when they were sent out on their journey. I mean, they were given that incredible ship, and they were given all these supplies, including a whole bunch of canned food items. However, what these explorers didn't know is that their canned food had become tainted with lead. And so as they slowly were eating all these canned food items, they were slowly poisoning themselves. And one of the side effects of lead poisoning, in addition to feeling nauseous and horribly sick, is it drives you crazy. It basically gives you these wild mood swings. And so like the whole ship, all these men are undergoing these totally insane mood swings and basically falling into actual mental hysteria out on this ship. And so in their hysterics, all these men decide to abandon their ship and head into the Arctic wild to forage for food and who knows what. I mean, they literally were out of their minds. And when they got to land into the wilderness, they didn't find food, they didn't find shelter, they found death and misery. And as they devolved into insanity and men began falling down and dying, because they were starving to death, they began eating their brothers. They began eating the dead men. That sled they were dragging along was not to preserve the bodies to give them a proper burial down the road. It was like their mobile refrigeration unit. They were dragging those bodies along and then eating them. And so the reason those Inuit hunters were so horrified when they discovered that campsite and they looked inside of that pot, well, it's because inside of the pot was clearly a human skull, and that skull had been cracked open as if whoever was tending this pot had literally been scooping in and basically eating this person's brain. To this day, bones of the crew members of that failed expedition are still being found on King William Island. One afternoon in November of 1980, 28-year-old John Reed sat at a table on a hotel veranda in the tiny village of Barcelos, Brazil, which was a 2-day boat ride up a river from the Amazon jungle's largest city of Manaus. And sitting across from John was the legendary chief of the Uga Mangalula tribe, Tatunka Nara. Now, John had been in Barcelos for about 10 days now, and in that time, he'd already spoken to Tatunka many times. But still, it was like every conversation they had gave John this incredible sense of awe. He really felt like his whole life had been leading up to this exact moment of being here in Barcelos, about to go on this grand adventure. So Barcelos and Tatunka were very far away from where John had grown up. I mean, this was a very foreign place. John grew up in San Francisco, California. But even growing up in those suburbs as a kid, he had always dreamed of coming here and literally meeting Tatunka. So it was like surreal he had really done this. And if things from here on out went the way John hoped they would, he might never have to even go back to America. Because John was on a bona fide quest. John was in Barcelos to be the person who finally found the long-lost city of Akakor. Now, there was almost no record of the city ever actually existing, except for in one book called The Chronicle of Akakor, which was by this author and journalist named Carl Brugger. Carl wrote that Akakor was the capital city of a 12,000-year-old civilization, similar to the Incas or ancient Egyptians, in that they'd lived thousands of years ago and had a big empire and an extremely advanced civilization for their time. But according to Carl, Akakor and its people were way better because they were descendants from actual gods. When the Europeans eventually came to the Amazonian jungle, the people of Akakor did not get wiped out because they went underground. And it was there, underground, that they rebuilt their capital and literally hid their civilization from the modern world. And in fact, the legend said that they actually still live there now, guarding a treasure that had been given to them by the gods. Now, most people called Carl's book complete fiction and said that its author just sort of made it up to make money. But John hadn't paid any attention to the naysayers, and any possible doubts that he had completely disappeared the moment he'd finally met Tatunka. So Tatunka was not only a famous chief who knew the Amazon like the back of his hand, but more importantly, at least to John, he'd actually been interviewed in Carl's book, and he was said to be the one known person who'd actually been to Akakor who was still alive. And here Tatunka was, in the flesh, sitting across the table from John in all his Amazonian glory. He wore just a loincloth, and he had that same turtle tattoo that the book described, so John knew he was the guy, he was the chief he'd been looking for. And to John, if Tatunka was real, well then surely everything else in that book was real too. Right now though, neither John nor Tatunka were saying anything, which was unusual because normally their meetings were very animated, as Tatunka regaled John with all these amazing stories about Akakor and what it was like there in his very heavily accented English. But hearing these stories hadn't been enough for John, who really wanted to know where Akakor actually was so that he could actually see it with his own eyes. Now, so far, Tatunka had not told John where it was. He'd said that the people of Akakor wanted to stay hidden. Their survival depended on it, and so he was not going to give up their location. But today, John could feel that something was different. Because just a few minutes ago, John had asked Tatunka again about literally going to Akakor, and now Tatunka had been very quiet for a very long time, like he was thinking about whether or not to finally reveal its location. And so John patiently waited. And as he sat there in this really intense silence, it was like he could almost feel Tatunka's deep wisdom oozing off of him in waves. And then finally, in his soft, very fragmented English, Tatunka began to speak. Almost 9 years later, on an evening in the spring of 1989, John's sister, 35-year-old Sandy Reed, pulled into the driveway of her San Francisco area home and got out of her car to check the mailbox. Sandy had just gotten back from her sales job, and she was tired and bleary-eyed as she, reached into the box and sort of mindlessly pulled out a stack of mail. But as she began sorting through the mail, the return address on one of the envelopes made her stop. It was a letter that was postmarked from Germany, and Sandy didn't know anybody who lived in Germany. And so she really wasn't sure what to expect as she quickly ripped it open. But as her eyes scanned the lines on the page, her hands began to shake uncontrollably. The letter was from a German detective who said that he was writing about her brother, John, and that they were sure something bad had happened to him. So John, Sandy's brother, had gone to Brazil almost a decade earlier to find the lost civilization of Akakor, and Sandy and her parents hadn't heard from him since he left. Now, during the first few weeks of John's trip, he'd written letters fairly regularly, but then his last message had come in late 1980, and after that, nothing. Now, of course, Sandy had been worried about her brother, but she also hadn't been that surprised he had gone radio silent, because Sandy and her parents were well aware that John was obsessed with Akakor, and not just that, he wanted to go on this adventure, find this lost city in the jungle, and then never come home. He wanted to stay in the jungle. And so they kind of figured that, maybe he found Akakor, or maybe he just found another village somewhere. But either way, the way they looked at it is John likely wanted to start a new life somewhere else, somewhere in the jungle, and that's probably what he had done. So for nearly a decade, that sort of became their line of thinking. But now, as Sandy is reading this letter, it was like suddenly her understanding of what was going on with her brother was totally and instantly fractured. Now she was both panicked and also totally confused about the idea that, one, John was in trouble, and two, why is the German police looking for her brother? Why is that happening? Why aren't American police looking for my brother? But as her eyes frantically scanned the page, she learned why. The detective said they were investigating the death or disappearance of John and at least 3 other people, including a German citizen, who apparently had been lured into the Amazon by a particular book about a place called Akakor. Now, this book, according to the detective, was complete junk. It was a fabrication. Akakor, not a real place. But the detective believed that someone was killing the people who came looking for it. Now, the detective said they had tried to investigate, but the Brazilian officials were being very uncooperative, and he wasn't actually allowed to go to Brazil to collect evidence to try to figure out what happened here. And so basically, he was stuck, but he wanted her to know they were looking into her brother. And so by the time Sandy finished reading this letter, she felt like, well, I have to do something. If the German police, if they can't go to Brazil, maybe I can. Sure enough, later that same year, in June, Sandy arrived in the city of Manaus in the Amazon and checked into her hotel. She knew from John's letters from 10 years ago before he disappeared that this was the general area he had been. And so her plan was, sort of roughly speaking, to search the city, turn it upside down, and see what she could learn. Now, obviously, this was a big undertaking. Manaus is a big place. But Sandy, at this point, was all in on this mission. Sandy didn't really know why. For 10 years, basically, she had no idea what happened to John. But it was like now, she felt like she was being called to do whatever she had to do to go find her brother. So she had quit her sales job, emptied her savings account, bought a flight here, and brought along a tape recorder, like an audio tape recorder, so that she would basically, not miss anything, talk to everybody and learn whatever she could and track it. And her plan basically was to just spend all her time interviewing locals, recording what they say, to try to figure out if anybody knew about John or Akakor. But almost as soon as she actually began doing this on the ground in Manaus, she realized how hard it was going to be. I mean, it had been almost a decade since her brother had gone missing. So when she met with the Brazilian law enforcement, they had virtually no details about his disappearance and really couldn't tell her anything useful. And when Sandy spoke to local residents, all she heard were endless rumors with no actual evidence. And on top of that, all the rumors she heard sort of contradicted each other. Some said a white man matching John's description had just recently been seen on the outskirts of Manaus. But then another person claimed John had been shot years ago and his bones had been found deep in the jungle. And then yet another person said, nope, none of that's true. What really happened is John found a tribe in the Amazon, not the people of Akakor, but another tribe, and he had decided to just live with them. Now, even though all this information she was getting was sort of all over the place, there still was one common reaction that almost everybody Sandy spoke to had: fear. Each time Sandy asked about Akakor, people would sort of clam up, like they were scared of it. Now, they all clearly knew about it, and most of the time when she brought it up, she was warned to sort of leave it alone, like don't talk about that, and that in some ways looking for Akakor could get her in trouble or even killed. So as the days wore on, Sandy just felt herself feeling more and more confused and anxious. And each night, as she laid in her hotel bed, she wondered if she should just give up, that this was impossible. But then it was like every night after she'd drift off to sleep, she would have a dream about John. It was like he was haunting her, and he would say to her in these dreams that Akakor was not what he thought it would be. So just about every morning when she woke up, she'd have this sort of refound sense of purpose, and she would continue to look for her brother. But it just kept going nowhere. However, during her last few days in Manaus, based basically on finances, like she was running out of money and would have to go home soon, during that time period, she heard another rumor. And that was that John had gone into the jungle to find Akakor, but he hadn't gone in there blind. A local chief named Tatunka had told John how to get there. Now, by this point, Sandy had spent 3 weeks in Manaus and its surrounding areas and really felt completely overwhelmed. I mean, she really hadn't made much progress anywhere. There was definitely a sense of fear around Akakor, and she was even starting to feel that like looking into this could potentially get her into trouble. And in many ways, hearing about this new person, Tatunka, whether they were real or not, it actually made her scared. She would love to learn what he knew, to go find Tatunka and see if he knew where her brother was. But there was also a part of her that just feared even pursuing this lead. It was like all of a sudden, Brazil just felt too overwhelming for her. And so after learning about Tatunka, Sandy's reaction was actually to pack up and leave. But after leaving Brazil, Sandy did not just, fly to California and give up on the search for her brother. She just decided to look for her brother sort of in a roundabout way. She had heard from a local in Brazil that there was a Swiss tourist who might have seen John in the jungle. And so after Sandy left Brazil, she went to Switzerland and spoke to this tourist. And then after speaking with that tourist, she flew to Germany and she met with that detective who had sent her the initial letter she got. But neither the tourist nor the German detective had any new information. So by the end of all that, Sandy still had no answers. And by this point, she also had no money. She had completely drained her savings account trying to find her brother, and it had not worked. Now, Sandy considered just going home. I mean, she was broke, she was scared, and really she hadn't actually gotten anywhere in her search for her brother. But there was still one lead that she had not investigated, and that was Tatunka, because basically it just felt too scary. She'd abandoned it and left for Switzerland and Germany. But Sandy felt like now, if she never went back to Brazil to speak with him, she would never get any real answers. It felt like Tatunka was the key, and she had been cowardly. She needed to go back there. She needed closure. So she went back to America, but she only stayed long enough to earn some quick cash cleaning houses so that she could finance another trip to Brazil. On June 21st, 1990, so about a year after she had made her first trip, Sandy did return to Brazil. She took a small plane to the village of Barcelos, which she had learned was where Tatunka lived. This time, though, she brought some backup with her, a documentary producer and also a reporter. She felt a lot safer coming here with a group, but also she did want to draw attention and resources to eventually help her with her brother's case. When they landed at the rundown airport, Sandy and her small team deboarded and walked straight into the tiny village. In the time that she had been back in America earning cash, Sandy had done some research on Barcelos, so she knew by now that Carl Brugger's book, The Chronicle of Akakor, the book that, John had been so interested in that led him on this quest, had really spawned an entire economy in Barcelos, since tourists came to talk to Tatunka and to try to find it. He was in Barcelos. But as far as Sandy could tell, the tourist boom had not done much for the village of Barcelos. It was dirty and the houses were all very rundown shacks. She'd read that only about 3,000 people lived there, and between all of them, they only had one phone. And so as the group wandered around looking for a friendly face to give them directions, Sandy spotted a woman who was hanging her laundry up on a line outside her home. So Sandy approached her and asked if she knew where Tatunka lived. And the woman immediately nodded, which Sandy expected, because Sandy had not just read up on Barcelos, she now knew a lot about Tatunka as well. And she knew that basically everybody in this area knew his name. He was a renowned chief who'd once led an expedition for the famous explorer Jacques Cousteau. And he was a hero too. One time he had saved the lives of a dozen Brazilian soldiers after their plane had crashed in the Amazon. So the country's secret service was actually in Tatunka's debt. And also, of course, Tatunka was interviewed extensively in The Chronicle of Akakor, that book, and was the only known person who'd actually been to the city and knew its location. But more recently, Tatunka had settled into a quieter life and was running a hotel and giving boat tours to visitors along the Rio Negro. And so Sandy got directions to Tatunka's hotel from this woman, and as Sandy and her team began heading deeper into the village to go meet this guy, Sandy felt a mix of excitement and also fear. There was just something sort of heavy about finally meeting this guy. Eventually, the group came to what appeared to be a very isolated-looking hotel surrounded by a wooden gate. And inside of the gated area, up on the veranda of this hotel, was this very lean, shirtless man with a turtle tattooed on his chest. And Sandy knew immediately from the tattoo that that was Tatunka. As Sandy and her crew opened the gate and walked towards Tatunka, she pulled out a photo of her brother and held it up, along with an explanation of why she was there. And Tatunka at first just kind of listened and watched as they approached him, but then as he began to hear what she was saying, he smiled, and in broken English, he told Sandy he was surprised she hadn't come sooner. But Sandy didn't return his smile, because as she stared at Tatunka, all she could think of was how wrong everything was. Tatunka's face, the way he spoke, the way he carried himself, none of it made any sense at all. It would turn out those dreams Sandy was having where her brother John would appear to her and tell her that, Akakor was not like he thought it would be, it would turn out that was correct. Akakor didn't exist. However, it was not just a fake city created by that author, Carl Brugger, to sell his book. No, it was something much, much weirder than that. That whole book was based almost exclusively on the stories of Tatunka, the legendary Amazonian chief who Sandy was now meeting, in front of this weird hotel. But Tatunka, the man standing in front of Sandy, was not chief of anything. In fact, he wasn't even Amazonian. In reality, this man parading around as Tatunka was just some random German man named Gunther Hawk who had fled Germany for the Amazon to avoid paying child support to his ex-wife in the 1960s. But when he arrived in the Amazon, he wanted to blend in, but he didn't speak the language, and he had this heavy German accent. So what do? Well, he created a whole made-up story about a long-lost civilization that he supposedly descended from, Akakor. The Akakor story was designed by this guy just to keep him from having to pay child support. The problem was, the Akakor story, the legend he created, worked too well. Gunther managed to convince local and even national authorities that he was an actual indigenous person. And then, fatefully, he also convinced this writer, Carl Brugger, that he really was from this lost civilization and sort of inadvertently created an entire tourism industry based on Akakor. And so when Carl's book came out, Gunther found himself in a bind. To keep his tourist revenue stream afloat, he had to keep pretending that Akakor was real and he knew where it was, while also never letting anybody get there. And both Sandy and the German police believe that to protect this secret, Gunther killed any tourists who insisted on actually visiting Akakor, including Sandy's brother, John Reed. Gunther Hawk has never been charged with murder and denies ever hurting anyone. John Reed's body was never found. The author, Karl Brugger, was shot to death in 1984 in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and rumors still circulate about who killed him and why. And as of 2024, Gunther Hawk was confirmed to be alive and still living in Barcelos, and still insisting that Akakor is real. To this day, explorers still travel to Barcelos to try and find it. On the night of November 14th, 1994, 56-year-old DeWitt Finley drove his pickup truck up a snowy single-lane highway in the Oregon mountains. It was late, but DeWitt was incredibly alert, and it was taking every ounce of his concentration to not crash. It was snowing really, really hard, and the road was incredibly icy. Not to mention, DeWitt was towing a camper van behind his truck, and the van was sort of sliding around and causing DeWitt to feel really unbalanced as he drove. And so as he's driving along, white-knuckling here, all he could think about was how having taken this route was such a bad idea. So DeWitt was a traveling salesman, and he sold fancy camper vans, which was why he had one on the back of his truck, to drive it around from city to city and to show it off to potential new customers. He'd just been in the Oregon coastal town of Coos Bay and was now driving to Grants Pass, which was in the southern part of the state. Now, the drive should have only taken about 2.5 hours, but DeWitt had decided to take a longer, more scenic route that cut through the mountainous national forest. Except that now, instead of experiencing a tranquil, peaceful drive with lush, stunning Oregon scenery, he was stuck in a snowstorm and fighting his way up a steep, heavily forested slope with a cliff on one side. Now, for just about anybody, this would be a harrowing experience. But for DeWitt, he was especially out of his element. He was from sunny Los Angeles, California. He never drove in conditions like this. And he had only very recently moved to Montana this past summer with his fiancée and 2 kids. And while Montana did have some harsh winters, he hadn't experienced them yet. So this was really a novel experience. But DeWitt was a very religious man. And so as this drive was spiking his heart rate and making him so stressed out, he's white-knuckling his way up this pass, all he began to do was just quietly, internally pray. And for a time, this all seemed to work. Maybe the prayer was working. He was staying on the road. He was making his way. He thought, I'm going to get through this. But eventually, the truck began to slide on the slippery conditions, and DeWitt sort of panicked and hit the brakes as hard as he could, which caused the vehicle to slide even more. And then the next few seconds were just a blur of snow and darkness and trees. And then after what felt like an eternity, where he's thinking, oh my God, I'm going to go off the cliff, his truck slammed into a snowbank, keeping him from falling off the cliff. After that, everything went quiet and still. And for a moment, DeWitt just sat there, completely stunned. His heart was hammering in his chest and his whole body was vibrating with adrenaline. But after a few minutes, DeWitt calmed down enough that he was able to kind of assess the situation. Number one, he didn't go off the cliff. So that was a huge win. He survived. And then he checked himself out, and amazingly, he didn't appear to have any injuries. And also, from the inside, it seemed like his truck was okay too. Maybe he dinged up the outside, from hitting the snowbank, but it just seems like he slid off the road and he was basically okay. To DeWitt, this felt like a miracle. He immediately felt like all that praying he had done had worked. God was looking out for him and saved him. However, when DeWitt put his truck in reverse and attempted to drive out of the snowbank, his tires just spun. They couldn't get traction. And so he realized, yeah, I survived the crash, but I may not be able to move. And I am up in the middle of the wilderness of the Oregon mountains. It's snowing like crazy. What do I do? Also, it's the middle of the night. He doesn't have a phone, doesn't have a radio, so he has no way to call anyone for help. He also wasn't expecting to be stuck, by the side of the road, so he didn't have food or water or really any provisions. And he also hadn't seen another vehicle for a really long time. So he had no idea how frequently people use this road, especially in the winter. And also, he wasn't even supposed to be on this route. So if anybody went looking for him, they wouldn't look here. However, just as, panic began to overwhelm him, DeWitt took a deep breath, said another prayer. God had already saved him once, and DeWitt just had to trust that he would do it again. Somehow, DeWitt was able to calm down enough, maybe it was his faith, that he was able to sleep. However, when he woke up, it was clear, one, it's still snowing outside, but worse, it had been snowing clearly all night because his truck was now way more buried in snow. The snow literally made it all the way up to the edge of his window. It's like multiple feet of snow out there. And so DeWitt, he turned his car back on and he threw it in reverse again, seeing if maybe now he'd be able to back out, pretty unlikely, but as soon as he hit the accelerator, the tires clearly spun, he didn't move. Now, it was daylight, and so he's thinking, okay, maybe now I can look around and see a house, a building, or some sign of life somewhere in the distance, just to give me a sense of how close I am to other people. But when he looked out his window, all he could see in every direction were trees and snow. He actually couldn't even see the road anymore and had no idea where it was since he'd gotten all turned around during the crash. And so he's just like in this whiteout, basically. And so DeWitt, at this point, was trying his best not to panic. And so instead, he focused on, what do I have? What supplies do I have right now? And he sort of began looking around the inside of his truck. And he found he actually had a lot of useful stuff in here. There were some cushions and a sheet, so he could make a bed for himself to curl up in. And he could also use the truck's heater to keep himself warm and to melt snow for drinking water. He'd obviously just have to be, careful not to burn too much fuel. Also, DeWitt had the camper that was attached to the back of his truck, which you would think would be great for a situation like this. You can just live in the camper until you get rescued. Except DeWitt knew this was not really a real camper. It was a demo model. It was unfurnished, there was no heat, no supplies, nothing. It was really just a shell, so not that useful. But once DeWitt was done doing this mental inventory, even though in some ways he had basically realized, I have very little, he actually felt a sense of calm come over him. He felt like, what? I have enough to keep me alive for a while, and in that time, I'm going to be found. And so he would just leave it up to God to save him once again. 2 days later, the storm finally let up. But even with the now clear weather, the snow didn't melt. And then soon after that, another storm came and dumped more snow and ice all over his truck. Also, during this time frame, DeWitt didn't see any other cars or trucks or plows. So he had a feeling that the road he had crashed on was now so clogged with snow, it wasn't even usable. But even though at this point DeWitt was extremely hungry, he had no food, it's been several days here, he also was warm and dry inside of his truck. And critically, he was also hydrated. He'd been drinking plenty of melted snow, so he was, surviving as best as he could. And then also, to ward off all the negative, intrusive thoughts about what could happen to him out here, DeWitt had begun to pass the time by meticulously crossing off the days in his yearly planning calendar and also writing letters. DeWitt always carried around pen, paper, and envelopes inside of his work bag, which he obviously had with him. So he had begun writing to the people he loved. His fiance, his sons, and even to his boss to explain what had happened and why he had missed work. And in each letter, DeWitt did not sound scared or sad. In fact, if anything, he seemed rejuvenated. He seemed happy. He would reflect on how much love and joy was in his life and how lucky he was to have that. And he would tell the people he was writing letters to, like his fiance and sons, that he really wasn't worried. He knew he was going to be okay, because God was clearly looking out for him. The days turned into weeks, but DeWitt continued to stay warm and basically comfortable and alive, even without any food. But DeWitt believed that his hunger actually was a sign that God was looking out for him. DeWitt had no idea how long somebody could live literally without eating. But after 2 months, DeWitt had tracked the days in his calendar. 2 months had gone by. DeWitt felt like I should be dead. I haven't eaten in 2 months. But he wasn't dead. And he felt like that was a sign. God was keeping him alive for his eventual rescue. It has to be. On the morning of May 20th, 1995, a teenager, along with his girlfriend, drove up the same mountain road that DeWitt had been on when he got into his accident. And even though it was May, there was quite a bit of snow still, and the road was still quite icy. And about halfway up a particularly steep incline, this teenage kid lost control of his truck. It began to skid, and he went off the road and crashed into a snowbank. Luckily, the teenager and his girlfriend were okay. And for a minute, they just sat there kind of dazed. And then the driver put the car in reverse and tried to move, but the car wouldn't move. The tires just spun. So eventually, the teenager climbed out of the car to examine his vehicle to see if there was serious damage here or if he was just stuck in the snow. But when he did this, when he climbed out of his vehicle, he looked just up the road a ways, and off the side of the road, basically equal to where he was relative to the road, was another vehicle. It was a pickup truck with a camper attached to it that was clearly half buried in the melting snow. And so the teenager told his girlfriend that he was going to go take a look in case, somebody else had a wreck and they needed help. So this kid, he leaves his girlfriend and he hikes over to the truck. And when he gets there, he can't see inside of it. It's covered with too much snow. But he brushes off some of the snow, revealing one of the windows into the truck. And he looked in, and for a second, he couldn't quite see what was in there. But then eventually he saw it. And when he did, he just gasped and backed up. After DeWitt crashed, he was certain he was going to be rescued. He knew he was in an isolated part of this mountain. I mean, he clearly knew that, but he really believed that God was going to save him. He felt like it was God who kept him from going off the cliff, and now God was going to intervene and save him, that somebody was going to show up and rescue him, effectively because of God. So because of that belief, because of how strongly he believed that, DeWitt did not get out of his truck. I mean, he got out maybe to use the bathroom, but for the most part, he stayed in his truck. And unfortunately, had he just gotten out and really looked around, he would have seen there was actually a paved path that, due to the way the winds whip on that side of the mountain, the snow doesn't stick to the ground. And so even with a huge snowstorm, he would have seen a black paved path going down the mountainside, and he could have walked it down to civilization, and it would have saved him. But DeWitt was so convinced that if he just waited here, somebody would save him because God was going to save him again, he just didn't leave his truck. And then when he began to feel that incredible ache from the starvation, the fact that he wasn't dying, months in with no food, it sort of built that resolve inside of him that clearly God has a plan. Clearly. I should be dead right now, and I am not. I need to maintain faith, and I'm going to be saved. And in many ways, that's beautiful. It's poetic in some ways. But it ultimately led to his death. That teenage driver who happened to get into a car accident up on that mountain road, who then saw the truck and the camper, well, that was obviously DeWitt's truck and camper. And when the teenager walked over and cleared the window and looked inside, he saw DeWitt, who was deceased inside of the truck. DeWitt ultimately died of starvation, most likely on January 19th, which is the final day that he crossed off on his calendar. June 26th, 1826, 38-year-old Samuel Willie Jr. stepped out of his house in a remote area of New Hampshire's White Mountain Range called the Notch. His wife, Polly, was at his side, and together they looked around in shock because the land surrounding their home was almost completely destroyed. There had been a huge storm the previous night, and so Sam and Polly had been expecting some damage. But what they were seeing now was far worse than they had imagined. The heavy rain had caused the river in front of their home to completely overflow, so half of their property was now completely submerged in water. The deluge had also triggered a rock slide from one side of the mountain slopes behind them, so there were also rocks and mud and entire trees that were now kind of littering their yard and adjacent fields. Sam saw, luckily, the slide had missed their house and the barn where they kept their livestock, but only barely. And there was damage to those structures from the storm itself that he would have to repair. So Sam began calculating how much time and money it was going to take to clean all this up. And next to him, he heard Polly kind of mumble to herself that this had all been a really bad idea. Sam sighed because he knew that Polly was referring to their decision to move to the Notch in the first place. And right now, staring at all this awful destruction right in front of him, he had to agree with her. This might have been a terrible idea. So up until about a year ago, Sam and Polly and their 5 kids had lived on a farm about 20 miles away from where they were right now, and it had been a very quiet, cozy life. But Sam had always had this feeling that he wanted to do something more exciting than just be a regular old farmer. And with this house in the Notch, he'd seen an opportunity for adventure and also an opportunity to make some money. So in this part of the White Mountain Range, there was a 12-mile long road that cut through the range from one side to the other. And the Notch house was right in the middle of that road. But since this was the year 1826, this road was more like a glorified trail. It was mountainous and rocky, and neither horses nor wagons could make it all the way through. So as a result, travelers were typically on foot. And there was literally nowhere to stop on this whole 12-mile road except for the Willie's Notch house. So Sam had realized how valuable this Notch house could be if he converted it into an inn. But he also had bigger aspirations for the place, like beyond it just being a pit stop. He wanted to turn it into a destination. After all, the White Mountains were incredibly beautiful, and where the Willies lived in the Notch was no exception. Their house was right on a riverbank in a mountain valley, surrounded on all sides by the woods and towering mist-covered peaks. It was all honestly breathtaking. And as soon as Sam had seen it, he knew that it could be a famous destination for poets and authors and artists because it was the kind of place people would write songs and books about. I mean, it was perfect. But so far, his dream, of coming out here to the Notch house had been a lot of work. The house was large, but really old, and it had been abandoned for a while before he and his family got there, so it was in really bad shape and quite dilapidated. Sam had hired 2 men to live on the property and help him fix it up, and they'd already done some work to expand the house and the barn to accommodate more travelers. But Sam knew he still had a lot to do before the Notch house became some kind of artist's retreat. And now, with this extensive damage from the most recent storm, he had even more things to fix, which he also had to admit was actually the least of his problems. Because as he and his wife Polly looked around at the aftermath of the storm, he knew, really, he was lucky that their house was even still standing, and that he and his family were even still alive. I mean, that storm was catastrophic. And as Sam thought about how close they'd come to death, his heart began to race. I mean, he wondered if Polly was right, and they should really at this point just pack the family up and go back to simple farming because it was safer. But leaving meant sort of admitting failure. His big dream would be over. There would be no artist's retreat, no tourist mecca. He would not be some creative benefactor. He'd just be a farmer. So he took a deep breath, and then he asked his wife to please give this place one more chance. He promised he would do everything he possibly could to not just repair the property, but also make it safe and secure so it could withstand whatever the mountain threw at them. And Polly hesitated, but ultimately she believed in her husband, and she nodded in agreement. For the next 2 months, Sam and his 2 hired workers worked practically around the clock repairing the damage from the storm. They fixed up windows and shingles and cleared away all the debris, which took forever. And then once all the repairs were done, Sam continued working, but now he focused on improving the property. As the weeks passed by, he worked very hard to build his family a very secure home so they'd be much safer against future storms. He reinforced walls and built a whole new roof and mapped out disaster scenarios so that he and his family would always be prepared. One disaster scenario that he was especially concerned about was the large boulder that was right behind their house. He was worried that if there was another big rock slide, that boulder might just topple onto them and crush them. And he and his workers soon realized that they couldn't actually move the boulder. It was just way too big. But in the end, they found a very creative way to make sure it would not be dangerous. And while Sam did all this work, he started to feel a lot better about everything. Each security measure he put in place was proof that he didn't have to sacrifice his ambitions for his family's safety. He could have both. A few weeks later, on the night of August 28th, Sam Willie stood by a downstairs window watching another wild storm rage outside. Heavy rain pummeled the glass, and Sam could hear powerful wind battering the sides of the house. It was pitch black out, but every now and then there was a burst of lightning that would light the whole valley up for a few seconds before it went dark again. Each time this happened, a crash of thunder would follow that was so loud it shook the house down to its foundation. Behind Sam, Polly, along with their 5 kids and the 2 men that were working on the property, were all sitting at the kitchen table. And Polly and the kids in particular were very scared, and the whole group were reading Bible verses, in these kind of frantic hushed tones, like they were trying to, will the storm to be over and to cling on to their faith, to pray that they'd be okay. Sam could hear the fear in his wife's voice, and he really couldn't blame her, because this was quite possibly the strongest storm that either of them had ever seen out here. It was even bigger than that one that completely destroyed their property over the summer. The rain seemed impossibly powerful, coming down so hard and so fast that the river had already overflowed. And each time there was a burst of lightning, Sam could see the water levels were getting higher and higher almost by the second. And so Sam was admittedly quite scared himself. He tried to keep that in, but his heart was racing and he was really anxious. But he told himself that this was the moment he'd prepared for all summer long. I mean, this was it. He had done so much work to make sure this was a safe place during storms. And he felt like they'd be okay. But at the same time, the deafening sounds outside and the terrified voices of Polly and his kids were making it really hard to believe that was actually true, that they were really okay here. So for a little while, Sam just kept looking out the window, listening to his family behind him. But then eventually he turned around, and as calm as he could, he told them all to go to bed. It was going to be fine. He would stay up and keep watch. Polly, who was visibly still very scared, nodded and got up and went off with the kids. And for the next few hours, Sam stayed at his post by the window and watched the storm. And for the most part, there wasn't a whole lot of drama. I mean, it was very loud and windy. It was obvious the river was flooding. I mean, there was going to be damage tomorrow, but Sam was thinking that, maybe we're going to get through this thing. But a little after midnight, Sam heard this sudden, extremely loud banging sound outside, and he froze because he knew it was not thunder. It sounded more like an explosion. Almost immediately, Sam knew what it had to have been. The barn must have collapsed. And thinking that this storm had just taken out an entire building that he had reinforced for a storm, turned Sam's worry into outright panic. And so Sam screams for his wife and the workers and his kids to wake up, that it's not safe, get away from the windows, we have to find cover. And so for the next few seconds, the family and the workers, everyone's frantically scrambling around, trying to find a safe spot, but they don't know where it is. But as they're sort of navigating, trying to find the right place to go to weather the storm, Sam heard an even louder bang, and then there were screams all around him, and then he felt himself go airborne as a heavy object slammed into his back. An exhausted traveler named John Barker walked down that road in the direction of the Notch House where the Willies lived. So John was a merchant, and he was passing through the White Mountains on his way home after a business trip. And he had made this trip many times before. He knew the road, but the road currently was flooded and there was rock slides and damage everywhere, so it was quite slow going and pretty miserable. But he knew at the halfway point was this house, the Notch House, where Sam Willie and his family lived, and they were looking to convert their house into an inn for travelers. And even though it wasn't fully established yet, John knew he could very likely get into that house, have a hot meal, rest a little bit before he made the rest of his journey. But when he finally rounded the corner into the valley where the house was, he just froze because the area was a complete disaster. The river had clearly completely flooded, and now half the land in front of him was just underwater. There had also been clearly a huge rock slide. The barn was only half standing, and the field in front of the Willies was completely buried in rocks and mountain debris. But the truly astonishing thing was that in the middle of all this destruction and ruin, the Willies' house was still standing. And as John maneuvered his way closer to it, he realized it was more than just intact. The house was pristine. There wasn't a single thing broken or out of place, not even a window. Relieved and a little amazed, John hurried right up to the entrance and knocked. But no one answered. So eventually he just opened the door and poked his head in and called out to Sam. But he didn't hear anything. No sound of a reply and nobody moving around inside. So John tentatively stepped all the way into the house and just kept calling out to the family as he walked from room to room. But he quickly realized the house was completely empty. It was also a mess. There were clothes scattered all over the floor and beds, and sheets had been yanked around and were messy, and the Bible was wide open on the kitchen table. John stood in the middle of the home trying to work out what could have happened here. The mess suggested that, clearly the family had been here somewhat recently, but had left in a hurry. So John guessed they must have gone down the mountain to wait out the storm somewhere else, either at a neighbor's or the tavern, miles away at the end of the road. And since the Willies were not here to allow him to stay, John needed to figure out what he was going to do. He didn't really like the idea of still sleeping in the home without them here. But he really had nowhere else to go. And it was almost nighttime, and he could barely manage the ruined road during the daylight, let alone during the dark. So even though he felt kind of bad about it, he picked a bed and tried to get some rest. But just as he began to drift off, he heard a deep, guttural moaning sound coming from somewhere outside the house. John immediately woke up and rushed over to a window, but he couldn't see anything. Night came really fast in the White Mountains, and it was almost completely dark outside. He waited to see if he would hear anything else, but he didn't. So he decided he must have imagined the sound and turned to go back to bed. But as he did, the moaning started again, and this time it was louder. John gasped as a terrible thought occurred to him. He wondered if maybe the sound was one of the Willies and that they hadn't actually left the property, but were maybe outside, injured or in trouble because of this storm. So John sprinted outside, but again, it was pitch black outside and he didn't have any kind of light to help guide his way. And so once he was out there, he just began shouting out, calling out to whoever it was, asking if they needed help. And eventually, the horrible moaning answered him. But the moaning kind of echoed all over the valley, so John couldn't pinpoint where it was actually coming from, other than it clearly being outside somewhere. After frantically looking around and not finding whoever it was, John realized that finding the injured person was going to be impossible right now. It was just too dark, and he would unfortunately have to wait until the morning. So, very reluctantly, John went back inside the house, and for hours he just sat in bed and listened to the moaning continue outside. Finally, in the morning, when the first bit of sun peeked over the mountain ridge, John hurried right outside to look around. And this time, he quickly found the source of that moaning sound. It was one of the Willies' oxen, moaning in pain from being trapped under some debris near the ruins of their barn. John immediately rushed forward and began hauling the wooden planks and rocks off the ox, and after he had freed the animal, it amazingly staggered to its feet and hobbled away into the woods. It was basically okay. But after it was gone, John felt this sort of sick uneasiness, even though the sound had been from an ox and he had saved it. He just felt like there was something wrong here, and so he decided that he had to go and see the Willies with his own eyes, just to make sure they really were okay. So even though it was really early and John was still very tired, he immediately gathered up his things and set off down the road. Hours later, around noon that same day, John Barker finally staggered out of the mostly destroyed pass and made his way towards the tavern at the bottom of the road. When John stepped inside, he was exhausted, he was drenched, from this awful journey he had just taken again on this road. But more than that, he was really worried about the Willies, because as he made that trip down the road, he saw neighbors' homes along the way and kind of expected to see the Willies in one of them. But no, the Willies were not in any of the neighbors' homes, and in fact, basically none of the neighbors were in their houses either. They were all basically in this tavern. It was like everybody who lived on this road had come to this tavern because of the storm. But when John looked around the tavern, he could tell the Willies were not in there either, and this made John's stomach drop. Because if they weren't at their house, and they weren't in any of the neighbors' homes, and now they were not in this tavern with the rest of their neighbors, that had to mean something was wrong. And so John actually called out to the entire room and asked if anyone had seen the Willies since the storm. And the tavern got really quiet as its occupants all began looking around at each other, seeing if anybody had, but eventually everyone just shook their head and said, "No, we don't know where they are." And that's when John said to the crowd that, well, the Willies are missing. A few hours later, a 12-man search party left that tavern and headed right back up the road towards the Notch. They were led by one of the Willies' neighbors, a man named Edward Melcher, who lived at the base of the mountain on a farm with his family. The recent storm had done quite a bit of damage to Edward's property, and so he and his family, like most other people that lived in this area, had gone to the tavern to seek shelter. Edward and his family, much like the Willies, were good people who were just trying to carve out a living in this part of the world. And there were not a lot of people doing that. I mean, this was a very small community, and so they always helped each other out whenever they could. And so this was no exception. But as desperately as Edward and the rest of the search party wanted to get to the Willies property and find these people, it took so long to navigate the road that by the time they actually got to the property, it was after midnight and really too dark to look for anything. So they just went right into the Willies' house to wait until morning. Once he was inside, Edward could see, the home really was just as John described. It was sort of a mess, but there was absolutely no damage to it from the storm. Edward had heard that Sam was really freaked out about a storm that they had had earlier that summer, and because of that storm and because of the damage it had done, he had gone way out of his way to really develop his property to prepare it for the next storm. And it seemed like all his preparations and reinforcements on his land had paid off because here his house was standing tall. But that was also kind of confusing. It's like, if you prepared this house for a storm, and clearly it was able to withstand the storm, why did the Willies leave? As Edward continued to walk around the house, he saw that the Willies' Bible was still lying on the kitchen table wide open, and when he leaned over and read the passage that was on the page, he couldn't help but, kind of shiver when he saw what it said. It said, "The Lord also thundered in the heavens, and the highest gave his voice, hailstones and coals of fire." Hours later, when the sun finally began to come up, Edward and the others went outside and began searching the property for signs of the Willies. And over the next few hours, the original party of 12 grew as more and more people showed up to assist in the search. By this point, word had spread pretty far about the family's disappearance, and so residents from all over the White Mountains had come here to help. And eventually, hundreds of people were combing the mountainside to find the Willies, or at least to find a clue about where they might have gone. At around noon, when still there had been nothing found, Edward decided he would go search closer to the river, since by this point, the water levels had gone down some. And when he got to the water's edge, he began to hear this strange buzzing sound, and so he followed it, and eventually, he saw something poking out from behind some debris. And when he saw what it was, Edward began to scream for help. So the thing that Sam Willie was most afraid of happening in a large storm was a rock slide, especially with that huge boulder positioned right behind his house. But when Sam realized it was going to be impossible to move said boulder, or otherwise shield his family from falling mountain rocks, he came up with a pretty creative solution. He built a whole second shelter that he and his family could run to if there was a bad storm. And when that second storm hit, the one that had caused all this damage and had led to the Willies' disappearance, well, during that storm, Sam's screaming for his family to, take cover, get away from the windows. He's heard this crashing sound outside that he is convinced is the sound of his barn collapsing and, his house is next. He's yelling for them to take cover. Well, the family listened to him, and together they did seek cover. They left the main house and went into that second shelter that they believed was better protected from a potential rock slide. But unfortunately, this would be a catastrophic mistake because that humongous boulder right behind the house was not actually a safety risk. In many ways, it was like a protective barrier. When there was an actual rock slide during this horrible storm, well, the rubble actually piled up on the backside of that boulder and did not strike the house at all. And so in essence, this boulder basically made the Willies' original home the single safest place to be on the whole property. But unfortunately, Sam and his family did not stay there long enough to realize that. They ran out of the main house as a big group, and as soon as they were outside, they were overtaken by the rock slide and killed. Eventually, the residents of the White Mountains would find the family. The buzzing that Edward heard was actually a group of flies gathered around a single human hand reached out from underneath the rubble. Ultimately, because of this tragedy, the area became a famous tourist destination, just like the Willies had hoped it would. People from all over the country heard about the family and what happened, and before long, artists and authors were coming to the White Mountains in droves to see the site of the tragedy, and some even wrote books about it. And so, in a sort of cruel twist of fate, Sam's dream did come true, just not in the way he hoped. On one of the last nights in December of 1678, Marie Bosse sat at a large table at a friend's dinner party in the city of Paris, France. The table was crowded with other party guests, and they were all listening to Marie as she told story after story about her life and her career. So Marie was a fortune teller, which meant, at least according to her, that she could read people's futures, usually by reading their palms or using crystals. And Marie was actually quite good at doing this, in the sense that whenever she told someone what their future was going to be, she typically was right, which was why, out of the 400-something fortune tellers in Paris at the time, she had some of the best and most important clients in the whole city. People like royalty and wives of very high-up government members and other very wealthy people of high society. And it was a big deal for Marie to even be in the same room as some of these kinds of people, because she did not come from money. Actually, there was a time where she almost had to live out on the streets, because years ago, when her husband died, she was left alone with her 3 kids and really no way to provide for them. But she'd worked very hard and actually ended up thriving. Her kids had grown up and she turned her fortune-telling talents into a real business. She'd been so successful that she really was maybe about 3 clients away from being able to retire. And Marie was not one to just sit back and let those clients magically find her. She was a self-made woman and knew it was very important to go out and find those clients herself. And so that's why she was at this party now. It was being hosted by a friend of hers who was also in the fortune-telling scene, and so many of the guests at this table were new potential clients that Marie really hoped to impress. So that's what Marie was trying to do now, to try to be very impressive. She was telling the other guests all these incredible tales about working with the rich and the famous. But the problem was, in addition to these fabulous stories she was telling, what was also coming through very clearly to the audience was that Marie was very drunk. So Marie was loud and talkative in general, and that extroverted attitude really helped her get clients typically. But when she got drunk, she was even more talkative than normal. And sometimes it also made her a bit inappropriate. Right now, though, she felt like she was on a roll, because her stories were drawing gasps and laughs, and the guests were pushing her to tell them more and more. But there was at least one person in the crowd that seemed bothered by what Marie was saying: the hostess of the party. The hostess kept silently glaring at Marie from the other end of the table. It was like she was silently trying to tell her to shut up. But Marie figured she knew why she was acting that way. I mean, the hostess was also a fortune teller, and so she must just be jealous. Marie's getting all this attention and potential new clients, and this wasn't even her party. Like, she just got to be jealous. So Marie ignored the glares and just kept on talking until dinner was over. And then after that, the party ended, and Marie staggered off to bed. When Marie woke up the next day, her head was absolutely pounding, and her stomach was in knots. I mean, she was severely hungover from drinking the night before. She didn't remember a whole lot about what had happened the night before, but she did remember telling a lot of stories. And she remembered that while she was telling these stories, the hostess was angrily glaring at her the whole time. And now that she was sober, a terrible thought popped into her head. She wondered if she'd said or done something that was embarrassing. What if the table wasn't laughing with her? What if they were laughing at her? And what if, the hostess glaring at her was some sort of signal to stop because she was hurting herself? And so this thought that, somehow she had done real damage to her reputation, her career, from being too drunk, continued to weigh on her throughout the entire day and into the following evening, until that night when she was in her kitchen making some dinner with her adult daughter, and there was a knock at her door. Marie hurried to open it up, and when she did, she found a young woman standing on her front steps. The woman seemed incredibly nervous and kept fidgeting and smoothing her hair. And she told Marie that she had gotten her name from someone Marie had met at that dinner party and was hoping that Marie could help her. And when she heard this, Marie smiled and exhaled out all the tension she'd been holding up over the last day. This was a huge relief to Marie. It was proof that the dinner party had not been a total embarrassment, despite the hostess glaring at her the whole time. That clearly, here she is getting a new client. She must have impressed at least this woman, and maybe there were more, like it had been a success. So very excitedly, she invited the young woman inside and led her to the area of her home where Marie conducted her business and read people's fortunes. This room had lots of strange objects placed all around it, like jars and crystals and bottles of potions and decks of cards to make the area feel mystical and authentic. The two of them eventually sat down at Marie's small table in the middle of this room, and once they were sitting, the woman told Marie that she did want her fortune told because she had a terribly abusive husband and she wanted to know how much longer she would have to put up with his cruelty. This didn't surprise Marie. She'd seen a lot of nervous, frail women like this one who were completely trapped in their marriages. In France at this time, divorce wasn't even legal, which meant you were stuck with your partner even if they were abusive. And so a lot of these women that were in this position turned to Marie, desperate to be told what the rest of their lives looked like, and if their lives would continue to be terrible and hard because of their partner. Marie knew that really what these women were looking for was control. They hoped that if they just knew what their future looked like, even if it was bad, they could somehow do something to change it. And so Marie, she reached out and she grabbed this woman's hand and she turned it around and she began to study her palm. Marie was trying to get a sense of what the future held for this woman by reading her palm. And pretty soon, Marie got this feeling in her gut. She felt sure that this woman actually was going to be okay. And Marie told the woman that her husband's abuse would end soon. Then she gave her some tips on what to do in the meantime. The woman was visibly relieved and thanked Marie profusely, and then when she was gone, Marie smiled. Not just because she had helped this woman, but also because, after this job, Marie would only need 2 more clients before she had enough money to retire. A few days later, on January 4th, Marie woke up to somebody banging on her door. She figured it must be a very desperate client, so she rolled out of bed and started walking to go answer it. But before she could get there, the door flew open and the Parisian police poured inside. Marie staggered back and just stared at them in complete shock. She had no idea what they were doing there, but they immediately just grabbed her and said she was under arrest. Marie screamed in protest and said there had to be some mistake here. She hadn't done anything wrong. And when they didn't listen to her, she got furious and demanded to be released. She told them that she was Marie Boss, and she had friends in high places like Parliament and noble circles. They could vouch for her and say that she was an honest person who just worked hard and was good for her clients and good for the city. But as she was ranting and raving, one of the officers stepped in front of her, and without reacting to what she was saying, they just showed her an object that Marie instantly recognized as having come from her fortune-telling room. And at this, her heart sank and she stopped struggling, because Marie knew that she was now in very, very big trouble. And if she was in trouble, then so were many, many other people in Paris. After Marie was arrested, she was brought to a prison in Paris called the Bastille, where she was interrogated by torture. And since Marie was already a talker, she quickly told the police everything they wanted to know. And after Marie did that, all hell broke loose. Hordes of police officers fanned out through the whole city, charging into homes and businesses all around Paris, arresting civilians, business owners, and housewives. Then they flooded the hall of the city's government and demanded high-ranking officials in parliament surrender their wives to authorities, throwing the Parisian government into absolute chaos. And even after all of that, the authorities still weren't finished. They left the city and began forcing the French nobility out of their castles to go face charges in the city. Months turned into years, and the arrests continued to pile up, and each one was more shocking than the last, until the investigation led authorities to the actual royal palace in Paris and to the king's favorite mistress. By the time the police finished their investigation, hundreds of people all across France, ranging from commoners to literal royalty, were either facing charges or sitting in jail cells. And screams filled the halls of these prisons as the arrested were tortured for whatever information they might have. Scores of people fled the country, and then eventually, all around Paris, these enormous pyres were built in the public squares. And one by one, dozens and dozens of people were led out to these pyres, strapped to the poles in the middle of them, and then burned to death in front of thousands of Parisian spectators. And it was all because of Marie. So Marie Boss was not just a fortune teller. She made her real money by making and selling poison. And it would turn out that she was not the only one. In fact, at the time, you could say Paris basically ran on poison. Since the late 1660s, according to one estimate, around half of the people who lived in that city, from housewives to literal royalty, had poisoned someone or been poisoned by someone. It had become absurdly common for people, especially rich people, to buy poison from Marie and the network of 400 or so other poisoners around the city, and use it to quietly commit murder so that the victims' deaths looked natural. But poison was not just used to kill people. It was sort of used like a solution for many kinds of problems, like people who wanted their romantic interests to be easier to seduce, well, they'd buy poison and poison them. Or people that had abusive or unappealing partners, they would use poison to make them sick and bedridden. Because remember, they can't get divorced. So if you're stuck with somebody and you don't like them, well, just poison them. It was also alleged that King Louis XIV himself was poisoned in non-fatal doses by his mistress, who wanted to make him easier to manipulate. Poison was even used for entertainment. One duo of poisoners baked deadly substances into cakes and handed them out to unsuspecting patients at a local hospital just to see what would happen. The poison affair, as it came to be called, was without a doubt at the time Paris's biggest and best kept secret, until Marie went to that dinner party, got really drunk, and let it slip. That night, Marie told stories of poisoning people, and people thought they were so funny because they didn't believe they were true. But one of the guests saw that the hostess of the party looked furious at Marie the whole time Marie was telling these stories. And so he wondered if maybe what Marie was talking about might actually be real, and the hostess is kind of trying to signal her to stop talking about it, but Marie was not taking the hint. So the following day, that dinner guest went to the police, and the police sent a woman to Marie's house to act as an undercover spy to see if maybe she could get proof that the poisonings were real. And lo and behold, when this woman told Marie that her husband was abusive and she just wanted to know how long this was going to go on for, Marie, read her palm and read her future, but then also gave her some tips about what to do in the meantime, which included handing her a vial of poison and saying, just go ahead and kill your husband, poison him. The object that officer had shown Marie when she was arrested was that poison. The investigation into the poison affair lasted for 3 years, and during that time, there were over 300 people who got arrested, from commoners to royalty. 23 of those people were banished, and 34 people were executed, including Marie Bosse. She was actually the first person to be burned alive on one of those pyres.